Welcome, everyone.
Female solidarity.
Thank you for coming to our panel, Motherhood as Living Tradition, Contemporary Reflections on Aquinas and Augustine. My name is Christina Bambrick. I'm in the Political Science Department here at the University of Notre Dame, and I am so thrilled to be moderating this panel here today. I expect we'll learn wonderful things from our panelists here, and I'm very excited about our topic in particular. So I will introduce our three panelists, and then I will let each of them introduce their paper titles and present their papers. You'll each have 20 minutes, and then I'll give you a couple of warnings as we get closer to time. So our first panelist is Angela Noble from the University of Dallas. Dr. Noble is professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas and a visiting fellow at the DeNicholas Center for Ethics and Culture this academic year. She received her doctorate here at the University of Notre Dame in 2004. Her work focuses on Aquinas' theory of infused virtue, virtue ethics, and applied ethics. Next, we have Veronica Roberts-Ogle, who is assistant professor of political and social thought and the Augustinian Catholic intellectual tradition in the humanities department at Villanova. She has taught there since fall 2023. Before that, she was assistant professor of philosophy at Assumption University, where she also served as associate director of the honors program and director of the Law, Ethics, and Constitutional Studies program. Her research focuses on the intersection between theology and political philosophy in Augustine's thought. She has published in journals such as the Journal of Religious Ethics, Augustinian Studies, and Studia Patristica, and is the author of Politics and the Earthly City in Augustine's City of God, published by Cambridge in 2020. And finally, we have Elizabeth Kincaid from Baylor University. Elizabeth Kincaid is Associate Professor of Ethics, Faith, and Culture at Baylor University's Theological Seminary. She also serves as the director of the Institute of Faith and Learning, where she works to develop programming that integrates Christian faith and academic excellence. She is also an affiliate professor of management at the School of Business. Dr. Kincaid's research focuses on the intersection of theological ethics, legal ethics, and business ethics, virtue ethics, natural law, early modern theology, and theology of work and vocation. Dr. Kincaid recently published the book Law from Below, How the Thought of Francisco Suarez Can Renew Contemporary Legal Engagement with Georgetown University Press. This explores different models for Christian engagement with the law. And she is currently working on a second monograph exploring the relationship between business ethics, theology, and human flourishing, which is under contract with Georgetown University Press. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And first up is Dr. Noble.
Okay, so thanks for having me. It's really fun to be here. I have a lot to say, so I'm going to try and go quickly. In her book on maternal ambivalence, Sarah LaChance Adams argues that motherhood has traditionally been idealized in ways that are destructive to mothers and children. So she argues that the mother is expected to sacrifice herself unstintingly to the point of self-annihilation without ever having a thought for herself. And she argues that these pressures to be angels actually sometimes cause mothers to end in being demons. And as exhibit A of the way she thinks that motherhood is traditionally idealized, she points to Piero Pagliolo's painting of the virtue of charity, right? And she says, you see, it's a mother, right? Like the epitome of charity is said to be a mother. And she proposes, by contrast, the image of Janus, the Roman god of thresholds who's kind of looking in two directions at once. She thinks this is kind of what mothers have to do. They have to take the perspective of themselves and the child and just kind of embrace the contradiction and recognize that there's sometimes no good way of doing both. Okay, so I was fascinated by this. I was particularly fascinated by the things she said about Piero Pagliolo's painting because I felt like it just had to be false. Like I felt like there had to be more going on than that. And a lot of what I do in this paper, because of time constraints, is just kind of work with that image and argue that it needs to be interpreted in a different way. Specifically, I think what's going on here is that medieval artists are using a physical bodily reality as a means of illustrating the change that charity affects in us. But then towards the end, and I'm going to have to kind of gesture more than explain fully, I want to turn to Adam's more substantial claim, namely that the mother is kind of caught in a fundamental, irresolvable tension between the child's good and her own. And while Adam sees only two possible responses to the maternal predicament, sacrifice of self on the altar of other, or kind of endless navigation of competing and irreconcilable claims, I want to argue that the philosophical underpinnings of Piero Palilio's image actually offer a kind of coherent and compelling alternative understanding of motherhood. Okay, but I'm going to dive into the images themselves because they're very interesting. So as I started researching images of charity, I found that this is a kind of known, common, well-recognized artistic trope from 1340 all the way to the early 1900s. When the virtue of charity is depicted in art, charity is depicted as a woman nursing a child, sometimes more than one child, often surrounded by other children, okay? This is so well known that when, in the fringes of a painting, when there's a woman nursing a child, the painting is referred to as having a caritas. So it's like a thing, okay? Although they acknowledge that those women often do not seem to be the mothers of the children they are nursing, which is interesting as well. We can return to that. But I was interested, so this is 1340, where it originates. I was interested in how we got there because I wanted to understand what it meant, okay? So I'm going to talk about the evolution of the image of the caritas first. Christian charity, right? So prior to about 1200, charity as a Christian virtue does not seem to be depicted in art. So we're leaving aside Roman caritas, which means piety, right? Something different. And there's good reason for this, okay? Because Christian charity involves a kind of relationship between you and God that manifests itself in outward actions to other people. That's a difficult thing to portray artistically, okay? But around 1230 in the Hildesheim font, you get a depiction of a woman wearing a crown, ministering to like beggars, okay? And this is understood to be a depiction of the virtue of charity, okay? So no nursing child going on there yet. Then in about 1250, Saint Bonaventure describes divine love in terms of a flame, okay? Whether that's causal or not, by about 1260, we begin to see depictions of the virtue of charity involving flames, okay? So at the pulpit of the Siena Cathedral, you can't really see the needy that are being ministered to, they're there, but charity, the virtue of charity, is depicted as holding a cornucopia from which flames are emerging, okay? So now we have a flame element in the virtue of charity. We still have ministering to the needy around the feet. We still don't have a nursing child, okay? And so if we jump, though, all the way to 1340, okay, now, this is the Tabernacle of Or, we start to see something different. So here we have the virtue of charity. Now, this is not feathers on her head. These are flames coming out of her head, okay? And now, for the first time, charity is nursing a child, okay? So something has happened between 1260 and 1340, and the question is what, right? It seems like something important happened because after this, depictions of charity always have a woman nursing a child. The flame continues for a while until the Protestant Reformation. The flame goes away, right? But the nursing motif persists, right? So it's really an interesting question to ask, like, what is that supposed to mean? And I spoke to a colleague at the University of Dallas who is an art historian, and she was the one who helped me see, well, we have to look at what else happens between between the 1200s and the mid 1300s. And one thing that happens at the beginning of the 1200s is it begins to become popular to depict Mary nursing the Christ child. So this image is not unknown before. In the 3rd century, there's an image in the catacombs of Mary nursing Christ. But after that, it's not really a thing until the beginning of the 1200s, when it becomes very common. And my colleague pointed out to me that, and if you look at similarities between the two images, they're very difficult to ignore. Similarities in attitude and so on and so forth. Now, importantly, I want to emphasize, nobody thinks that the virtue of charity is supposed to be Mary, right? That's not going on, right? But there does seem that the image of charity as nursing a child does seem to appear after depicting Mary nursing Christ becomes popular, okay? So we should think of it in terms of that move. Now, what I'm going to say now, it's helpful in this respect. It's helpful because art historians don't talk about what caritas nursing a child means, except to claim something that I don't think it means, namely the idealization of motherhood. But they do talk about what Mary nursing Christ means, okay? My colleague, former colleague Michael Gorman always used to like to say, I report, you decide. I'm not sure what the imagery of Mary nursing Christ actually means. I'm going to describe some meanings because those potential descriptions gave me a kind of aha moment about what I think the caritas means, okay? So there is a lot of lactation symbolism in Christianity. Lactation is not really like something I feel comfortable talking about, so yeah, there we go. But there is, right? So in the Song of Songs, God is described as nursing. In Corinthians, right, Paul says that he's going to give mother's milk to the new converts before they receive strong food. There's historical imagery. There's a lot going on. There's, in fact, too much going on. There's an embarrassment of riches, and you want to be careful theologically about what you think that symbolism means. Some art historians, though, have pointed specifically to the symbolism between mothers and sons. And so they point out that going back to Greek and Roman art, the mother either bears her breast to her son or reminds her son that she nursed him in the context of mediating his anger, trying to make the son more merciful. So Hecuba, right, when she's begging Hector not to go out to fight Achilles, reminds him that she nursed him and bears her breast, right? So some art historians hypothesize that this has something to do with the symbolism because in some images, right, Mary is nursing Christ in the foreground as, for instance, sinners pour into heaven in the background, right? So some have proposed that perhaps this is an image of Mary's intercession, right? Mary is also said to be the mother of mercy, right? Christ's humanity has something to do with Christ's mercifulness, okay? So this is, I'm not gonna kind of wed myself to any of those interpretations, but those interpretations kind of gave me a aha moment for what I think might be going on in the image of caritas, okay? So we have Mary nursing Christ. This is an image from the 1500s, and we have the image of the caritas. My hypothesis is that in the picture of caritas, the recipient of charity is the child in the image, right? So there's no ethos of motherhood here. The charitable person is not the mother. The person who's receiving charity, I think, is the child, right? So Christ in his humanity, his justice is tempered with mercy. But in the image of caritas, I think the idea is that God's grace is restoring quiet to a distraught and disordered soul. God's grace is calming us in the way the milk of the nurse calms the upset, angry, frantic child, okay? And I want to point out that certainly in the philosophy of Aquinas, right, certainly in the medieval philosophy that medieval artists would have been informed by, this is the understanding of what charity does to us, okay? So we are made for union with God. We initially exist in union with God. In the state of integrity, thanks to our nature, as it is perfected by the gift of original justice, our will is subject to God, our reason is perfected to God and subject to Him, and our reason and will perfectly restrain the lower powers of the soul. We're in harmony, right? We're at peace, and we're united with God. But what sin does is cause complete disorder in our souls, right? So the will is no longer united to God. We're kind of pulled inordinately towards our own particular good or our own perception of our own particular good. Our appetites are pulling us in discordant ways. And we're drawn inordinately to mutable goods. Charity restores that order, right? Charity reunites us, our will to God, right? And begins to bring calm and quiet to our soul. So Aquinas says the immediate effect of charity is joy, right? We're back where we belong. We're reunited. You can imagine like a screaming infant when its mother picks it up. And the other immediate effect of charity is peace, both with ourselves and towards others, right? Little babies that have been fed are much more delightful to be around, right? They're less angry. And this is us when we're reunited to God, okay? And so now I want to, and I'm going to have to do this in a kind of cursory way, but I want to talk about how I think this helps us begin to give an answer to the kinds of things that Adams is worried about. So Adams' worry, right, is that when we identify, which she does think, right, when we identify with the needs of a child as our own needs, then she thinks we get pulled in all kinds of different directions, right? Because we want the things we know to be good for our child. We still want the things we know to be good for ourselves. And we get pulled in discordant ways, and she thinks there's no one good way of ordering them. And she thinks she thinks we just have to navigate this, like we're just stuck. There's no good way to navigate all of those conflicting things. But the thing is, Adams thinks that it's up to us to order all of the conflicting loves we feel, right? It's this tremendous responsibility. We have to think of all the needs that we identify with, and we've got to kind of put them in place, and we're never going to be able to do it perfectly. And so we end up like Procrustes, right? So, you know, in the Greek myth, the guy's got the bed and he chops people up to fit the bed, right? We kind of have to chop our loves up and sacrifice some of them so that they can kind of fit, because there's no right ordering, okay? And this is the part that I can't go into in detail a lot. But the thing that I want to point out about Aquinas' view of charity is that Aquinas does indeed, I mean, more than Adams. Aquinas recognizes that to love other people is to identify their good as our own, right? So love is unity. And when we see ourselves as united with another in some way, we want for them, right, for their sake, what we would want for ourselves, for our sake. So if my neighbor loses his dog and I love my dog, I want my neighbor to find his dog for his sake, and because I know, like, I feel that, right? So I do want all of these things, even to a greater degree than Adams admits, right? The difference is, though, that Aquinas doesn't think we're the ones who have to figure out how all of these things fit together, right? Far to the contrary, to have charity, right, is to recognize that you are part of an order, right? So Aquinas says we naturally love God above all things. And he doesn't mean that like we go around like knowing who God is and loving him directly. What he means, what he explains what he means is that we naturally recognize that the good of the whole takes precedent to the good of the part. And even beyond that, there are wholes nested within other wholes, right? And to have charity is to recognize the existence of that order, right? Not to know how everything fits into that order at all, but it is to recognize that it is always destructive to go against that order, right? And so resting in the order of charity, recognizing the order of charity, makes possible a kind of rest, a kind of peace, because we just recognize there are things we can't do, right? The things that offend that order and destroying the part is something that destroys that order. Destroying the good of the whole for one of the parts is also destructive of that order. There are just things we can't do. And it's restful for there to be things we know we can't do because we recognize that we're not the ones in control. And so I think in there, you find the seeds of a very profound answer to the kinds of dichotomies that Adams and others think we find between mothers and children. And I think the way forward is to deny that we are the ones responsible for fixing everything and for making sure that there is an order that solves all of the problems. So I'll stop there.
Angela, I thought you were going to tell me how to solve all my own problems as a mother, so a little disappointed. I'm going to talk about some other problems that I think we can't solve. I don't actually remember the official title, but it's on Aquinas and adoptive motherhood. So one of the hallmarks of internet culture back in the dark ages where we were still writing blogs was, at least in certain corners, the usually evangelical internet adoption mom influencers. Now, thankfully, leaving behind the societal shame that had often, for earlier generations, accompanied adoption, many of these moms promoted a narrative which held up adoption as a positive good to be pursued by Christians, an echo of God's actions towards us. However, after the fundraisers, the pictures of the joyful encounters, at least for the adoptive family, with the soon-to-be adopted child and the triumphant courtroom pictures, many families found that their joyfully formed blended families were not the end of the story. Some children seem to have adjusted into their new families with relatively little struggle. Some, however, face significant mental and physical challenges. And of course, the challenges and heartbreaks of the birth families rarely featured in these blogs either. Human adoption, it turned out, was much more challenging and more complicated than simply being a mirror of God's adoption of us. In what I think is probably the best survey of the field of theological reflection on adoption, written by Holly Taylor Kuhlman and published in the Journal of Moral Theology a while ago now, in 2012, Kuhlman provides some crucial insight into the state of theological discussion regarding adoption that was behind a lot of these mommy blogs. She makes the point first that there's actually surprisingly little contemporary theological reflection on adoption, especially given adoption's significance as a theological theme. Secondly, she makes the point that what theological reflection there is almost all written by adoptive parents. Very little is written by adopted children, and even less is written by birth parents. Kuhlman scrutinizes the literature that does exist and provides a helpful typology of common Christian responses to adoption. So on one side, predominantly but not exclusively Catholic authors I'm going to call this the Catholic perspective, even though it's not fully representative, focus primarily on the social ends of adoption, using theological categories of natural law and the common good. These approaches present adoption as a secondary imitation of the reality of biological kinship, but one justified by its contributions to societal common good, which requires that children should be cared for and appropriately formed. As Kuhlman writes, this approach often seems to include, quote, a fundamental insistence that adoption is always caught up in and directed towards purposes larger than the individuals involved, close quote. In addition, it often valorizes the goods of birth as often the only, or at least the preeminent marker of identity, describing adoption as a social adaptation to sin, but not really focusing on the adoptive bond as a relationship with its own value and significance. On the other side, predominantly, but not exclusively, evangelical authors, so I'll call this the evangelical perspective, these approaches focus more on the relationship between the individual adoptive parent and adoptive child. Usually, the way in which the so-called, quote, selfless love of the adoptive parent creates bonds which echoed the divine human bond. This approach focuses much less on the importance of biological kinship, upheld by the Catholic natural law approach, and instead usually relies on a much more direct reading of Scripture, often the Pauline epistles, discussions of adoption. Nothing evangelicals love, and I say this with all due respect, better than a quote to the book of Romans. Taylor Kuhlman herself, an adoptive parent, finds these views lacking. First, she's rightly concerned with the evangelical approach because of its tendency to negate the reality of the biological bond. And I think this is what the mommy blogs kind of exemplified, an equally concerning move that accompanies this narrative that positions the adoptive parent as the savior. The adoptive parent is God and Jesus. The adopted child is the sinful human. In addition, the direct connection of God's adoption of humans through Christ to human adoption tends to put pressure to craft a pristine, flawless narrative around adoption rather than acknowledging the complexities and tragedies that accompany the adoption process. Kuhlman finds the Catholic approach, however, almost too societally focused. She notes that it can be detached from the familial realities of adoption. It doesn't focus enough on the individual families. In addition, by focusing so much on the social impact narrative and the priority of biological kinship, she argues that the Catholic narrative can minimize the possibility that we recognize that there is positive emotional and relational significance to the adoptive bond, that this can be in its own way a real thing. Kuhlman is an adoptive parent, and I am an adoptive parent, so I come to this topic with a fair amount of fear and trepidation, adding to the discussion by adoptive parents on adoption. It's easier to talk about legal ethics, but I'm also concerned by the dichotomy she outlines, that it reflects, doesn't reflect the complexity of the adoption experience on either side. So in this paper, I'll expand on Kuhlman's argument to look for an articulation of a theology of adoption which acknowledges both the complexities and the gifts of these non-biological family relationships. In considering the tradition of theological reflection of the source, I'll bring into conversation a different scriptural source, not the Pauline epistles, but rather I'll focus on the consideration of Jesus' own familial relationships in the gospel as they are articulated and explored by Thomas Aquinas. So when I started thinking about this paper, I actually was surprised that in his commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew and on John, Aquinas devotes, not a lot, but a non-negligible amount of space to considering earthly familial relationships, both biological and non-biological, between families in the Gospel. Jesus, of course, has a father, God the Father, as well as an adoptive father, Joseph. Mary has a biological son, Jesus, and an adoptive son, the Apostle John. The Apostle John, conversely, has an adoptive mother, Mary, and a birth mother, Salome. And of course, we hear repeatedly that all Christians have their own biological parents and are adopted into God's new family. I don't want to say that Aquinas' understanding of adoption and parenthood are identical to our own. They're not. But I think his analysis of the different aspects of identity implicated by adoptive and biological family bonds, his articulation specifically of the role of the mother as mediator and advocate for the benefit of her child and of the community, and finally his consideration of the adoption scene at the Passion provides an eschatological vision of the restoration of family bonds, which incorporates both adoptive and biological parenthood without nullifying either. So first, let's turn to the question of flesh and spirit, which provides the theological framing for Aquinas' analysis of human adoption. Obviously, for all Christians, and we've spent a year, I think a lot of us, celebrating the Nicene Creed anniversary, who Jesus' parents are, and the meaning of his relationship to each parent is crucial for Christian claims related to Christology and soteriology. And Aquinas focuses his exegesis of John 1 around these questions. While he's mainly focused on Christology and soteriology, I think in his commentary in this passage, he begins to lay the groundwork for his claims regarding human familial relationships, to which he returns later in the commentary. What does the evangelist mean, he asks, when he states that the Logos gave power to become sons, quote, not by blood, but rather to all who believe? This statement, Aquinas argues, does not negate the reality of being a child by blood. It's very important that Mary is Jesus's biological parent. It's Christ's human nature that makes our own adoptions as daughters and sons possible. Having emphasized the biological as crucial to our own adoption as God's children, Aquinas then turns to argue that adoption does transform us. However, here he provides a theological description of divine adoption that continues to emphasize the continuance of the biological while not negating the reality of the transformation that comes from adoption. So he describes the infusion of grace, which transforms our nature without destroying it, the transformation of our actions, which don't destroy our human free will, and finally, our eventual glorification as children of God, the eschatological transformation, but which involves the resurrection of our earthly bodies, not just saying, gosh, biological identity doesn't matter. Through this exegesis, we see that spiritual adoption in God's family results in an accumulation of identities, not a destruction or abandonment of our biological human identity. So unlike the evangelical approaches to human adoption, which prioritize adoptive parents over the biological parents, Aquinas would argue that God's perfect selfless love does not erase our human nature. Unlike the Catholic view of adoption, which tends to prioritize the natural, our spiritual adoptions must be ontologically real and therefore constitutive of our identity and transformative of who we are. Now, of course, as I said with my critique of the evangelical approach, human adoption is not equivalent to heavenly adoption. Adoptive parents, unlike God, are not perfect. My children would tell you that. And adoption is not a perfection of the adopted child. However, Aquinas points to appropriate analogical similarities between the two in his consideration of the impacts of adoption on identity when he looks at the relationship between Jesus and his adoptive father, Joseph. In John 1:45, so later in the same chapter, the Apostle Philip greets Jesus as the son of Joseph. Was Philip correct in this identification? Aquinas asked. Having spent so much time, pages and pages, earlier in John 1, identifying Jesus as the Son of God, is this second identification of Jesus' paternity plain wrong or insignificant? Obviously, in one sense, this response indicates simply how much Philip, a brand new apostle, needs to learn about Jesus. However, Aquinas claims, in another sense, Philip's identification of Joseph as Jesus' father reveals a deeper truth. Aquinas points out that even Mary, who is well aware of Jesus' true paternity, actually refers to Joseph as Jesus' father in her conversation with the boy Jesus in the temple in Luke 2:48. She says, "Your father and I have been looking for you in sorrow." Both of these identifications of Jesus, Son of God and Son of Joseph, are completely appropriate, Aquinas argues, because they acknowledge that Joseph does fulfill an important fatherly function in his care and nurture of Jesus throughout his childhood. While adoptive parenthood does not nullify biological parents' paternity, this does not mean there's no relational reality or significance. Aquinas goes on to consider this overlap of identities between biological kinship and adoptive kinships in human terms at an even further level of complexity in his analysis in Matthew 12:48 through 50. In this passage, remember, Jesus is told that his mother and brothers are outside. Rather than responding to their demands, Jesus rhetorically asks, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Instead of acknowledging his family, who, remember, are right outside, he points to the disciples and says, "These are my mother and my sisters and my brothers." It might seem, and I think there are theological approaches that argue this, that when read in conjunction with Luke 14:26, the passage where Jesus says, "Leave father and mother," that we are seeing a rejection of biological parenthood for Christians who are called into a new family. However, and Aquinas references this Luke passage in this commentary, he again emphasizes the importance of the biological bond, with specific emphasis upon Mary's role as Christ's biological mother. And he reads the passage, and this was new for me, as acknowledging, not nullifying, the reality of Jesus' relationship to Mary. He argues that Jesus here is making a point, not that Mary isn't his mother, but that his relationships with those who are adopted into his father's family are equally real and also place demands and obligations upon him within the bond of love. Aquinas goes on to take this consideration of the complications of familial relationships even farther by arguing that the brothers with Mary in the passage are not Jesus' biological brothers. They obviously can't be Mary's. He says they also can't be Joseph's because of Joseph's chastity. Rather, he points out this reference to Jesus' brothers acknowledge that we all experience relationships with people who are not our immediate biological family, but are bounded to us by familial-like bonds. So contrary to some of the natural law theorists around adoption, the biological bond is not, in fact, the only bond which is natural. For example, speaking from his own life, Aquinas points to the realities of bonds between brothers in religious communities. By owning these brothers from Jesus' past community, but also highlighting the importance of his new brothers through adoption and ministry, Aquinas reads this story as reinforcing the natural ways in which familial-like belonging incorporates relationships developed through other forms of connections. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to finish up by talking about Aquinas and motherhood. So, I want to turn towards Aquinas' reflection, not just on parenthood generally, but on the role of the mother, considering how his description can be read as addressing the shared complementary role of the adoptive mother and the birth mother in caring for a child. So if you look at his commentaries on Matthew and John, we see that Aquinas praises two different mothers for the exact same action, serving as mediator and advocate seeking the ultimate goods for their children. The imperfect, but still, according to Aquinas, likely praiseworthy example of this type of mother is the mother of James and John. In Matthew's version of the encounter, she comes to Jesus to ask that her son, James and John's, be seated on his right and left hand. And again, and what was a surprising read to me, Aquinas paints Salome as a generally praiseworthy example of motherhood. She approaches Jesus devotedly. She has an appropriate awareness of Jesus' power and authority, and so turns to him to seek what is best for her children. Rather than depicting her as being importuning or nagging, Aquinas depicts her as somebody who's bold in seeking the good and prudent in going to the right source for the good. Jesus, perhaps her idea of the good is not perfect. Aquinas acknowledges that some commentators read her as seeking earthly glory, but Aquinas himself seems to lean towards the exegesis of Chrysostom, ending his consideration of her actions with Chrysostom's claims that she's an exemplary mother seeking spiritual good. And Aquinas' consideration of her request actually perfectly mirrors his treatment of Mary's role at the wedding in Cana in John. And here he's explicit that Mary's request for Jesus to provide wine demonstrates her role as mediator and advocate. His meditation on the text centers around Jesus' question to Mary when the wine is run out. Woman, what is that to you and me? And the following phrase, "My hour has not yet come." He considers a lot of different interpretations, but just as in the Matthew from Matthew, he prefers Chrysostom's interpretations. He says here, when Jesus says, "Woman, what is that to you and me?" Jesus is not asking a rhetorical question, but a genuine one. Mary's request, according to Chrysostom and Aquinas, shows she's not anticipating Jesus' ministry too early, but fulfilling the role of a good mother, quote, burning with zeal for the honor of her son. Chrysostom's reading Aquinas seems to indicate is preferred because it aligns with the internal logic of the story. Jesus isn't saying, "Mary, why are you dumb?" but rather he responds to her pleas by turning the water into wine. Mary appropriately models the role of mother as mediator and advocate for her child's ultimate good. Although both of these examples involve mothers advocating for biological sons, when we look ahead in the narrative to the Passion, towards which both of these stories point, when Jesus' hours have come, we are aware that adoption enters the story. Mary, having lost her own son, will become the adoptive mother to Salome's son, John. While Aquinas himself doesn't make this point explicitly, I think the value of his emphasis upon the importance of the role of mother as mediator and advocate for her child's own good provides a definition of motherhood capacious enough to encompass both the birth mother and the adoptive mother. In choosing to give up a child for adoption, the birth mother makes the ultimate self-sacrificial gesture, the birth mother, not the adoptive mother, on behalf of her child, seeking the child's greater good at an unimaginable emotional cost. While I don't want to naively dismiss the many unjust economic and social factors which may exert pressure on the birth mother to make this decision, I don't want to diminish her moral agency. The view that the role of mother is to serve as mediator and advocate also provides space for adoptive mothers to care for their children in a way that's not limited to biological kinship, promoting their children's good for their own benefit and the benefit of the broader community. This is the common good argument from the Catholic perspective comes back in. Although the sacrifice required is a different kind of sacrifice than that made by birth mothers, it does require that the adoptive mother is willing to enter into spaces of discomfort and challenge to secure the greatest good for her child, even if it means sacrificing her own idealized view of adoptive motherhood. Unlike the evangelical approach, this view of motherhood does not erase the importance of the birth mother. Unlike the natural law view, it does not diminish the motherhood of the adoptive mother to a more general service to the common good in caring for somebody else's child. Rather, it creates space for both, an opportunity for collaboration in caring for the child in both.
Hello. My paper is entitled Monica, Mother of Tears. Can you hear me? Is it low enough now? Is it? Okay, good. All right. Early in the Confessions, Augustine regretfully recalls how he dismissed his mother's pleas for chastity as mere woman's talk, instead opting for a promiscuous path of torturous suffering. Watching this, Monica stood by, helpless and unheeded. And yet, as the Confessions unfolds, we are presented with a conversion narrative that portrays Monica, Mother of Tears, as Augustine's very lifeline to God. By weeping and praying for the soul of her son, Monica exhibits a form of maternal fidelity which cannot but move the heart of God. From Augustine's mature perspective, it is ultimately her love, conformed to the love of the Father, which accounts for his radical conversion. She participates in her son's salvation because of her maternal love. Monica is a tiger mama and not a perfect saint from the beginning, but her willingness to submit her love for Augustine to God purifies her maternal instincts and ultimately brings her and her son together to the heavenly kingdom. So, what can mothers learn from Monica's story today? Much, I think, especially for those who share her anxious tendencies. Indeed, the first time I read Confessions as a mother, her character sprung off the pages in a radically new way. Here, I thought, was a woman that I could identify with. She was not in any sense chill or sanguine. Instead, she was fiercely protective and flooded with worries for her son. Overcome with paternal instinct, there were things she had to learn the hard way. At the start of my own maternal journey, I desired to take her wisdom into my heart. I knew I would need it. Carrying it with me, what I'd like to offer today is the good news I've taken from Monica's story. In short, I found it illuminates a path to sanctity that both enfolds and purifies our love for our children. More than this, it reminds us that we're but cooperators with a heavenly Father who loves them far more and far better than we do. This is the best news any mother can hear, and to dwell with it is a gift. To read the Confessions I've found as a mother is to strain to hear Monica's voice within it. So while my students often come away from book one with complaints about Augustine's cynical view of babies, I always come away in gratitude that I've heard his mother's voice. Indeed, when Augustine says that he knows he was welcomed into life with tender mercy, it is her word which serves as proof. Other hints of Monica hover in the background. Here's where I hear them most clearly, and there's overlap with Angela's talk. My mother and my nurses did not fill their own breasts. Rather, you gave me an infant nourishment through them in accordance with your plan from the riches deeply hidden in creation. You inspired in those who nurtured me the will to give to me what you were giving them, for their love for me was patterned on your law, and so they wanted to pass on to me the overflowing gift they received from you. It was a bounty for them, and a bounty for me from them, or rather not from them, but only through them. For in truth, all good things are from you, O God. This whole passage is full of Monica's words, received by Augustine in trust and love. Put differently, her confessions shape his. When Augustine tells us of God's plan hidden deep within creation, it's Monica who taught him to notice it. It is she who discovered within herself the overwhelming desire to give to her child. And it is she who found God within that desire. Disclosing these discoveries to her son in loving conversation, Monica revealed the dawn of that love which defines their whole story. Coming upon her as an inbreaking, this love reveals the fatherly heart of God to her in a way that deepens her bond with him and with her son. The overflowing gift of his love, poured as it is into Monica's heart, serves as the anchor that preserves mother and son on their stormy journey to sanctity. Signs of this storm appear early. At the same time that Augustine highlights Monica's deep love for him, he also points to a rift that exists between them because of his incapacity to fully receive this love and trust. Indeed, Augustine the infant is fallen Adam. We all were. Surrounded by bounty and love, he is already deeply distrustful. We see this reflected both in the jealousy of the nursling who glared with fury at his fellow babe at the breast, and in the frustrations of the child who cried for fear his needs would not be met. Monica, I imagine, like many mothers, probably felt despondent in such moments. I am trying to help you, trust me. The trust so often associated with childhood is not for Augustine unwounded. So the feelings of maternal helplessness hinted at in these passages come to a head when Augustine enters adolescence. Taking a break from boarding school due to his father's lack of funds, Augustine loiters around his hometown with nothing to do. This at precisely the age when inactivity is liable to get him into trouble. So falling in with a group of boys who embody what he wants to be, confident, comfortable with themselves at a highly uncomfortable age, Augustine becomes unreachable. Monica knows he has great potential. She's let teachers impose harsh punishments on him so that he could learn, and she's felt confirmed as his teachers reported his talent. She's imagined his successful future. Now all that seems on the line. She hates watching her son, used to the discipline of the schoolroom, roam wild about town. She hates that he panders to foolish friends, and she hates who he is with them. Word has gotten back to her what they say together and what they do together, and she sees it in how he is at home with her. Of course, we get all this from Augustine's perspective. Going through puberty, the thorn bushes of his lust shot higher than his head, so that he was drawn to friends who bragged about their sexual antics, and he longed to imitate them. Monica, we hear, did everything she could to talk sense into him, describing the intense earnestness with which she cautioned him against unchastity. He recalls that she urged him to keep clear of fornication and especially not to commit adultery with any man's wife. But Augustine admits that he dismissed these as mere women's talk, which he would have blushed to heed. This must have been intolerable for Monica. She must have lay awake at night, fearing he was on the brink of making choices he had no idea were of consequence. His need for guidance and utter unwillingness to accept it was probably infuriating. So Monica had a heart bursting with the desire to help Augustine get things right, and a growing sense that she was out of her depth in trying to make that happen. So she watched from the sidelines as he became sexually promiscuous and then joined a cult. She really panicked then. Overhearing Augustine torment less educated Catholics with finicky questions, she must have thought that all this cultivation of his intellect was for nothing. She must have regretted not having him baptized. We know she prayed for someone to show him the emptiness of his so-called truth. Encountering a bishop with the rhetorical chops to do it, she cornered him. Would he be so kind as to talk to Augustine? The bishop refused. The youth was still too puffed up with the novelty of his heresy. He was, as yet, unteachable. So it was a dark period. During it, Augustine says, Monica regarded him as dead. And I think that's where you see where he got his flair for the dramatic from his mom. But in all seriousness, for those of us who look at our children and wonder how the kinks will iron out, this moment of grief and Monica's response to it especially offer a real lesson. Monica could have succumbed to her sense of powerlessness. She could have kept trying to control the situation. She could have burned the bridge. She did none of those things. She stayed close to Augustine, and she handed him over to God. Now, this is not something that happens perfectly and all at once. And one of the reasons that I cherish Monica's story is that it reveals what it is for an imperfect mother to become a saint. We all know she could be a little bit smothering, and we know she had expectations for Augustine she needed to let go of. But what matters, and why it's such a gift to have Monica as a role model, is that God offers her and her son a path to salvation, and she takes it. And because she does that, Monica's profound maternal instinct and her deep love for Augustine are caught up in the love of God in a way that ultimately gives her back her maternal agency. God provides a home for her love and offers her a way to channel it so that nothing of it is lost. So how does this happen? Well, it starts with Monica's tears. Augustine assigns remarkable power to these tears. Explaining why God had mercy on him, he exclaims, "You, Lord, stretched out your hand from on high and pulled my soul out from the murky depths because my mother, who was faithful to you, was weeping for me more bitterly than ever mothers wept for the bodily death of their children." Like the persistent widow, Monica moves God to mercy. Unlike the judge worn down by the persistent widow, God makes space for her to do that. He moves her to do that. Celebrating that God has built Monica's tears into the very economy of salvation, Augustine writes, Thanks to your hidden providence, O my God, your hands did not let go of my soul. Through my mother's tears, the sacrifice of her heart's blood was being offered to you day after day, night after night for my welfare, and you dealt with me in wondrous ways. God's paternal love and Monica's maternal love work together. One remarkable instance of this dynamic can be seen when Monica's prayers miraculously save Augustine from death without her knowing. Here's the story. Having just abandoned Monica on the shores of Africa, Augustine falls gravely ill in Rome. She, for good reason, is furious at him sneaking off. but she soon resumes praying for him. Though she knows nothing of his illness, a mercy, I think, God allows her prayers to be the reason he has mercy on Augustine. You heard her in the land where she was and took pity on me where I was. Reflecting that had he died, he would have died in his sin, Augustine remarks, if a blow like that had struck my mother's heart, she would never have recovered. Going on to describe how diligent she was in making her daily offering to God, Augustine portrays Monica's fidelity as his lifeline. Would you, O God of all mercy, spurn the broken, humbled heart of a chaste and temperate widow? Could you, whose grace had made her what she was, disdain those tears and rebuff her pleas for your aid when she tearfully begged from you the salvation of her son? God cannot but hear Monica's prayers and enfold them into his loving plan for her son. Her fidelity is caught up into the fidelity of a merciful God. Here, I think, Monica's story offers us great hope. Since God is the same yesterday and today, our prayers for our children go into his safekeeping, just as Monica's did. Through Monica, God is calling us to entrust more, to entreat more. Yet this is not the only gift Monica's story offers us. It also liberates us from an ersatz idea of what it means to entrust our children to God. It's tempting, at least to me, to imagine that if we did this properly, we would not be anxious. But in Monica's case, this is simply not true. As Augustine writes, I can find no words to express how intensely she loved me. With far more anxious solicitude did she give birth to me in the spirit than she ever did in the flesh. Or, again, she who had given me life to the flesh was very anxious because in her pure heart, through her faith in you and with a love still more tender, she was bringing my eternal salvation to birth. This idea that as mothers, we are given the privilege of birthing our children not only in the flesh but also in the spirit is remarkable. But we have to admit that birthing is an anxious process. Monica teaches us to make peace with that anxiety. More than this, she shows us that we needn't pretend to be different or indifferent mothers to become holy. We can be passionately intense, passionately ourselves, so long as we offer all the loves in our heart to God and let God do the work of purifying them. For this reason, I'm tempted to say that Monica's story is God's pledge of fidelity to all anxious mothers. While our maternal instinct, like Monica, will need to be purified, the ongoing activity of placing our children and our anxiety for our children in God's hands is that path to purification. Dwelling with Monica's story reveals this. She too has a set of hopes for her son that prove to be wrong-headed. We've seen how she corners a bishop, expecting him to be the one to help Augustine see the light. She also expects academic success and a good marriage to be a catalyst in his conversion. Each of these hopes are dashed. And yet, they prefigure the better things of God's plan. Ambrose eventually comes along, another bishop. Augustine's success leads to a self-reckoning, and celibacy provides the liberation from lust that Augustine needs. Thinking about this can inspire us to be more open-handed with our wishes for our children. Monica reminds us that God's ways are not our own. And yet, it's not a given that the disappointment of our hopes will purify our maternal loves. It's the fact that Monica never stops taking God's promise of fidelity seriously that allows her to be purified. It is also what allows her to receive that first bishop's advice to leave Augustine alone and simply pray for him, and to take from that her maternal mission. As this bishop famously tells her, it is inconceivable that a son of tears like yours will perish. Augustine tells us that Monica often recalled how she had taken these words to be an oracle from heaven. Monica, in other words, teaches us to look for the ways that God is trying to strengthen us as he purifies our desires and to receive these consolations as gift. Indeed, when we read that Monica received prophetic dreams, what we need to realize is that Monica has become good at opening up herself to God's nudges. She looks for them and so is able to draw strength from them. They are what allow her to do the difficult work of accompanying Augustine along the way. Paradoxically, this habit of looking out for divine consolation is also what allows her to get better at distinguishing her own wishes from God's will. We see this in her attitude as she goes about arranging a marriage for Augustine. For context, Monica had long desired to see Augustine married, and as a catechumen, he began to desire it himself. And so, the mature Augustine writes, in light of my request and her own desire, she besought you daily with powerful, heartfelt cry to show her in a vision something of my future marriage, but you never consented. She did have some illusory, fantastic dreams brought on by the activity of her own human spirit as she busied herself about this matter, and these she related to me, but without the confidence she usually showed when you revealed something to her. To these dreams she attached little importance. She claimed that by something akin to the sense of taste, a faculty she could not explain in words, she was able to distinguish between your revelations to her and the fantasies of her own dreaming soul. Monica, then, still has desires for Augustine that she hopes are part of God's plan. This is human. And yet her habit of attending to the ways that God speaks to her loosens her grip on them. She still passionately offers them to God, but with a confidence in the superiority of God's plan. So how is such a confidence forged? In Monica's story, one moment seems especially illuminative. This is when Augustine, still a Manichae, has been offered a job in Rome, and Monica really doesn't want him to go. Or if he goes, she wants to come with him. And Augustine does not want that. So with difficulty, he writes, I persuaded her to spend the night in a place very near our ship, a memorial chapel to Blessed Cyprian. And that same night I left by stealth. She did not, but remained behind praying and weeping. And what was she begging of you, my God, with such abundant tears? Surely that you would not allow me to sail away. But, and listen to this, in your deep wisdom, you acted in her truest interest. You listened to the real nub of her longing and took no heed of what she was asking at this particular moment, for you meant to make me into what she was asking for all the time. Writing that God was both using his lust to put an end to them and chastising Monica for holding on to him too tightly, Augustine reads his story as the act of divine mercy she soon discovered it to be. For by the time she braved the stormy sea to follow him, Augustine had become a Catholic catechumen. So, because Monica chooses to entrust Augustine to God every time that all seems lost, she gains personal knowledge of God's fidelity that transforms her anxiety from the root. She discovers a deeper kind of confidence, one that is not feigned, but graced. Indeed, Augustine remarks how striking it was that when she heard the news of his becoming a catechumen, there was no wild excitement or agitation in her heartfelt joy. And this could not but remind him of her reaction back when he, as a Manichae, had attempted to reinterpret her prophetic dream. It was not he who would stand where she was, but she who would stand where he was. Even then, Monica was eerily certain of what God had disclosed of her. He was disturbed by her confidence that he would stand where she was. When, now that he had abandoned Manichaeism, she told him very tranquilly and with full confidence that in Christ she would see him a faithful Catholic before she departed this life, he was again struck. She was, he reflects, certain that God, who had promised her everything, would grant what was still lacking. And he did. So Monica's confidence stands as a divine sign for Augustine amidst his wanderings, and for us. All told, and this is where I'll finish, Monica's trust in God is the golden thread that leads them both to salvation. It deepens, expands, and purifies her maternal love, so that when she does receive the converted Augustine in from the garden years later, her first reaction is to marvel that God has the power to do more than we ask or understand. Converting her grief into a joy far more abundant than she had desired, God had, she reflected, granted much more than she had been wont to beg of him in her wretched, tearful groaning. So, dwelling with this good news, we are invited to draw strength from Monica as from one who has gone ahead. Entrusting our children to God alongside her, we endure the anxiety of motherhood in hope, remembering that our tears and prayers are ways of bringing our children to spiritual birth. Embracing this labor in love, we can travel the path of graced confidence to joy that is open to even the most anxious of mothers. Thank you.
All right, we have about 10 minutes for questions, so we'll collect a few, and our panelists can answer what they're able, and then we can come back to the audience and see if we have time for more. So feel free to start.
Hi, Benjamin Colombo from the Augustine Institute. Love Augustine. As this is for sorry. Yeah, as someone who has had a parent leave the Catholic faith, what is, I guess, a strength or a draw you can take from St. Monica for us to bring people back to the faith with love?
We'll collect a few more, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists. Anyone else? Yes, over there.
I wanted to ask about well, obviously I'm not a parent, but I know a lot of families who do have out of the church people. And what if they like a mom hits a wall because, well, I just don't go and cry in front of God. I don't have that emotional, overflow. And so I'm not in Monica's league, and so I don't get anything from Monica. How would you help that person?
Maybe just a couple more. Any for Professor Noble, Professor Kincaid? Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Kincaid. So I guess I was wondering about biological children of parents who have relationships with adopted siblings, and just not only like the relationship between adopted children and their parents, but how as an adopted parent you may navigate the relationship between non-adopted and adopted siblings, especially in light of recognizing that maybe like this idyllic version of family is not what you should be expecting necessarily, but also like emphasizing that they are just as much a part of the family as any other children.
Maybe one or two more? Yes.
Just for our listeners, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on stepmotherhood. This is a little different from adoptive, and especially when the birth mother is very much involved in the child's life.
And any questions for Professor Noble? Yes, right here.
I was very interested by the idea that caritas is something that we receive as something that is meant to quiet us. But does that not mean that we can give and reflect God's charity to others?
Last
A question to Angela Knobel. You asked the question, where does it come from? That charity in its earliest representations appeared with a child. Maybe you could find some models in Telos, earth representations in ancient reliefs and sculptures. Earth, Telos, as a kind of a renaissance before the proper renaissance in the 12th and 13th century.
Thank you for those beautiful and difficult questions. So, I was writing this pretty narrowly as a sort of therapeutic project, but it does seem to me that Monica, this lesson to entrust more and to entreat more, that's true for all of us. So it's really the way in which God hears our prayers, all of our prayers, not just the prayers of mothers. And so the prayers that a child has for a mother, I think the same logic holds. It's really this amazing thing that we're allowed to participate in the salvation of one another. A friend of mine just wrote a book on Augustine, his early dialogues, and in it Augustine uses the language of parturire, so birthing, all over the place, and he talks about how he and his son are bringing one another to birth into the heavenly kingdom. So it's interesting that this Augustine, at least, thinks that a father can bring a son to birth, and a son can bring a father to birth. So this idea of bringing one another to the heavenly kingdom, to spiritual birth, is a sort of universal. So that, I think you can take it and translocate it, and that same love, that same bond, the same goes. And with regard to not having any more tears, I mean, that's a suffering of its own, right? To not be able to have any more tears. And I think there's a love that is demonstrable there. So hitting a wall is also in itself, I think, a form of offering to God.
And yeah, thanks also for y'all's personal questions. So on the biological kids and the adoptive kids who are in one family together, I mean, one of the things that struck me about these passages is that they're not just about the parent-child relationship. There's a lot in them about sibling relationships. And I think that perhaps part of the role of the parents who have biological children and adopting is realizing that when you kind of let go of this ideal of the perfect adoptive family, that this does have impact on all the kids, and that this, and like I said, you know, when I was closing, talking about the sort of this mother's duty of advocating for the good of your child, and that needs to extend. I think as an adoptive parent, you can have this sense of, well, I need to prioritize my adoptive kids because they need me more, and that it really needs to be for all children. And I think also realizing, and we see this in these scriptural texts, Aquinas is emphasizing in his repeating also on siblinghood, and when he's talking about, like, I mean, I do wonder how much he's thinking about his own really problematic relationship with his mother when he's looking at sort of these, what you want in a mother. But he also does talk about the importance of sibling relationships, and that sibling relationships are formed. So perhaps not having this expectation on biological children that it's all going to be easy for them as well. And then this vision, this theological vision of adopted siblinghood is equally real and equally important. And then on the step parent question, one of the moves in adoption over the last 20 years has been saying, look, kind of what's optimally best for an adoptive kid is, as much as it's feasible, having a connection with the birth parent. So I think actually our sort of thoughts around adoption are moving not identical to being a step parent, but moving closer. And I think I would say probably for a stepmother, it's the same call of responsibility of this advocacy and being a mediator for your child, and saying, both acknowledging the biological bond, but being open that God is going to form new bonds and new connections, even if it's not the way that you thought it was going to look. So I think to Veronica's point really struck me about Monica got what she wanted, but it didn't look it wasn't in the package she thought it was coming in.
Yeah, so as,
You can, I don't know. Do you want
I
mine?
don't think we need it. You can hear me, right? So as regards to the question about charity as extending to others, I mean, to me, this is the really beautiful part of the image, because I think what's conveyed, and what you clearly see in Thomas Aquinas, is that you can't act in loving ways to other people until you are at peace with yourself. And being at peace with yourself means resting in God's order instead of trying to be the source of order for yourself. When you're very concerned about you don't have the space to care about other people. So I really love Simone Weil. She has this thing where she says that the person who gets the grail, when people are searching for the grail, the one who gets the grail is the first person who stops to ask the guardian of the grail, like, what are you going through? And I think that while we are chaotic and disordered and torn apart, we're unable to ask other people what they're going through because we're so wrapped up in ourselves and our own turmoil. And then I don't know if I fully understood the point about ancient cultures. I always think it's great to look there. I think it's complicated to look to ancient cultures, because I think what Christianity proposes in charity is something so new. I mean, I certainly think even in the thought of Aristotle, you do have this understanding of the self as a part of greater communities. But yeah, I mean, if you have ideas about that imagery, I would love to hear them.
I just want to hint on this theoretical framework of pictures of charity in the centuries 12 and 13, because before the word texts came in facades of French cathedrals and churches, also in Germany and Central Europe, you find pictures of the three theological virtues inside a wider context. That means this reflecting on ethical value of life, human life, precedes the visual imagination or image making.
Oh,
And,
okay.
But philosophers and theologians need creativity, picture makers, these artists. And they search for sources, how to represent. So one key or door to find solutions to explain the first formula, visual representations, could be to study the texts, to speak about Prudentius and other texts of late antiquity which describe with attributes these virtues. Maybe you find some sources of children who represent the needy humanity, for which takes care, charity. So this is a proposal to search solutions in texts of early scholastic people and schools.
Okay, thank you, thank you.